Thank you very much for coming to the New America Foundation. I'm Peter Bergen. It's really a pleasure to host my old friend, Nir Rosen. As many of you know, Nir has spent years reporting in Iraq, was almost kidnapped by the Taliban. I told him it was not a good idea to go. And luckily it was a very brief kidnapping. Spent a good deal of time in the refugee camps of Lebanon, where an al-Qaeda affiliate has taken root and has a long, distinguished history of reporting. I often say about Nir, I think Nir is the only person in the history of journalism who went from being a bouncer to a New Yorker writer with no intervening step, because that was his first debut, was in the pages of the New Yorker, in the early phases of the Iraqi civil war. Nir is a fellow at the Center of Law and Security at NYU. He's leaving for Iraq this evening for a 3-month trip. He's going to be working with a variety of refugee organizations. And what Nir and I discussed was that he would sort of talk about the key findings of his book, and then we would have a brief conversation and throw it open to your questions.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, by the way, Nir dressed up for this.
It's my nicest shirt. Half of my book deals with Iraq. The other half deals with the impact of Iraq on the region. 2 chapters on Lebanon and how the Iraqi civil war spilled over into Lebanon in terms of al-Qaeda fighters from Iraq fleeing Iraq to Lebanon, Sunni Shia strife from Iraq increasing in Lebanon, and people throughout the region, but especially in Lebanon, increasingly viewing local conflicts through this prism of Saudi-Iranian conflict or Sunni Shia strife. It culminated the impact of Iraq on Lebanon in the 2007 fighting in the northern Nahr al-Bared refugee camp. And then in 2008, there was Sunni Shia fighting, sort of a 1-week mini-civil war. So I look at some of the al-Qaeda networks in Lebanon that were affiliated with Iraq. And then I look at Afghanistan, finally. And then the impact of Iraq in terms of regional radicalization and how the refugees are destabilizing local economies and very fragile local sectarian balances. But the point I argue in the book, and perhaps not even forcefully enough, is that we can't understand Afghanistan and what the U.S. is doing in Afghanistan, and what it thinks it's doing in Afghanistan, without understanding what happened in Iraq and what the Americans think happened in Iraq. Because there's a national mythology by now, it's almost impossible to assail or undermine about what happened in Iraq, now that we've sort of moved on and forgotten about it, that you had kind of a muddled occupation justified by one reason after another, democracy, weapons of mass destruction, al-Qaeda, whatever, wasn't going very well. And then in 2006, we had the Samarra Shrine bombing in February 2006. And then the Civil War broke out and all hell broke loose. And it was only thanks to a genius general who could run forever and do 100 push-ups and rethought the whole way we do war that we were saved and Iraq was a success. And we can move on to Afghanistan, where the same general, he was preceded by another genius general with a PhD who could run 8 miles every day and all that, who was going to save us, but had some bad PR. So now Petraeus is going to save us in Afghanistan because he saved us in Iraq. And to begin to understand why maybe that can't happen or won't work in Afghanistan, we have to understand what really happened in Iraq, even if everybody wants to move on, except for me. The civil war in Iraq didn't begin in 2006. It began in 2003. As soon as the Americans won the war, they basically lost the war because the vacuum that was created following the easy defeat of the Iraqi military, which for the most part chose not to fight even, the vacuum that was created resulted in the immediate creation of militias, Sunni and Shia, tribal, based on various local identities, that for the most part ended up dominating Iraq. Today they're wearing military uniforms or suits of politicians. But the pervasive sense of lawlessness that was created in April 2003 and very much remains to this day. And we saw immediately a huge increase in violence, street violence in Iraq. All night long in April 2003, you could hear gunfire, and it wasn't Americans fighting Iraqis, it was Iraqis fighting Iraqis, settling scores, criminal activity, protecting neighborhoods, nascent resistance groups were being set up that would later on become Islamic Army of Iraq, 1920 Revolution Brigade, the Mahdi Army. And politics very quickly took on a sectarian tone. In part, it was thanks to the American occupation. It was very natural for people to cling to their group identity. If you took away the police and mayor and every state structure in New York City, I think you'd very quickly have local militias being formed. Lower East Side, Upper East Side, East Harlem, Upper East Side probably wouldn't do very well. Jewish, Puerto Rican, people are going to cling to their identity. And we've seen, even in the aftermath of Katrina, what happens in the U.S. when you remove the state and people are scared. They become lawless very quickly. The Americans took that chaos and they approached Iraq with a very sectarian prism. Iraqis were primarily Sunni or Shia to them, and there were ancient hatreds in their mind. The Ba'ath Party became a Sunni party and became a Nazi party, so we were saving the Shia Jews from the Sunni Nazis. In reality, of course, the Ba'ath Party was majority Shia. There were Shias almost all the way to the top of Saddam's regime. Sectarian identity was much more complex depending on your class, on your level of education, whether you're urban or rural, rich or poor, secular or religious. There's a lot of intermarriage. Iraqis tend to romanticize sectarian relations. You know, we married each other, we drank from the same two rivers, we were all belonging to the same tribes. There was resentment and sort of private sectarianism among many people, especially beginning in the 80s and 90s. Many Shias maybe resented, especially if they were poor or religious, the sense that they were somehow marginalized a little bit. Many Sunnis maybe looked down on Shias as being uneducated, as they do throughout the Arab world, or so poor or somehow inferior. But that never expressed itself in any violent kind of way. Iraqis were warning from the beginning that the Americans are trying to create a civil war, which they weren't, of course. But looking at history backwards, it almost looks as if the Americans took every single step they could take to create a civil war, creating a sort of puppet governing council in the summer of 2003 based on sectarian identities, so many Sunnis, so many Shias, so many Kurds. Even the Communist Party member of that governing council was chosen, not because he was a leftist or secular, but because he was a Shia. And we treated Sunnis as if they were the bad guys. The American military posture was much more aggressive in Sunni areas. Fallujah is a good example of that. It was a quiescent town. Nobody had ever heard of it outside of Iraq before the war. And in Iraq, it was known before the war just as a place you stopped to get some kebab, at a famous kebab place on your way to picnic at Lake Habaniya, which was a popular picnic place. Industrial, not very wealthy, middle class or poor town. Nothing about it made it predestined to be this resistance town. I mean, I've seen people in Mogadishu wearing Fallujah T-shirts. So it became a symbol, but there was nothing inherent about Fallujah that made it unique. The first couple of weeks, the Americans didn't even occupy Fallujah. Locals took over running the affairs there. And the Americans came in and occupied a school. There was a demonstration. The Americans thought they heard a shot fired. Perhaps they did. They fired back, killing over a dozen demonstrators and killing more in the following demonstration. It began to turn the local population against the American occupation. I mean, they were predisposed to be skeptical, but they were willing to give it a chance. In fact, local foreign fighters who came in to Fallujah to try to stoke up resistance were very frustrated at first, they told me, because they were unable to initially provoke any kind of insurgency or anti-occupation resistance. I'm going to skip the insurgency because that's not really what the book is about, but Fallujah is important because Fallujah is where, in a way, Iraq's cross-sectarian hopes died and the civil war, in a way, began. In April 2004, you had a Shia uprising in the spring of 2004 in much of Iraq, and a Sunni uprising, Fallujah in particular. And you had Shia militias supporting Sunni militias in Fallujah, and Sunni militias supporting Shia militias in Najaf and Kufa. It was a moment of sort of cross-sectarian unity against the American occupation, and I was very optimistic, actually. I mean, on the one hand, it was the death of the American dream for Iraq. On the other hand, I thought this was a moment Iraq there were more and more stirrings of sectarianism and fear of civil war. And I thought, just like the 1920 revolution in Iraq, which has been mythologized as some kind of great national uprising against the British, so too could Fallujah and Najaf be something similar, where Iraqis can have a national bloody myth of overcoming the occupation and get over the sectarian differences, and Shias being perceived as collaborators with the occupation, and Sunnis being perceived as being pro-Saddam. So the first Battle of Fallujah had that Sunni-Shia unity. I saw Mahdi army fighters collaborating with local mujahideen in Fallujah. It didn't work out because, for a variety of reasons, Shias have been absorbing on a daily basis constant attacks on the part of Zarqawi sort of inspired anti-Shia extremists. Shia markets were always being bombed. Shia truck drivers going from Baghdad to Jordan will be stopped on the road by Fallujah and slaughtered because they were Shia. So Shias began to blame, with some cause, people in Anbar and Fallujah for sheltering the guys that were slaughtering Shias. And by the time Fallujah was sort of destroyed in late 2004, many Shias felt like they deserve it, and they didn't lift a finger to help their Fallujah brethren in the second Battle of Fallujah. Also, Muqtada Sadr sort of made a calculation that it was better to he would test the American occupiers, push it to the limit, and then retreat before he got totally finished off. So Sunnis began to resent this Shia sort of collaboration with the occupation. Fallujah was destroyed in late 2004. A couple of 100,000 Fallujans fled into western Baghdad. Many of them also having ties to the insurgency. They displaced Shias living in western Baghdad, in Amriya, Ghazaliya, other parts of West Baghdad. Those Shias fled to East Baghdad, began to displace Sunnis living over there. And by late 2004, we saw the beginning of a displacement and of the civil war, so being community against community. 2005, the Iraqi government is elected, dominated by sectarian Shias. And we see a phenomenon, you can call it Monica phenomenon. The U.S. issued Nissan Pathfinders to the Iraqi Ministry of Interior. Iraqis have a nickname for every car: Dolphin, Duck, Monica. Monica is a nickname for the Nissan Pathfinder. The Nissan Pathfinder has a wide rear end, like Monica Lewinsky. So you would have Monicas going into Sunni neighborhoods with guys in weird uniforms hanging out of them with machine guns. They'd pick up Sunni men, and they'd be found a couple of weeks later in a garbage dump or some sand lot. You saw the beginning of collaboration between Shia militiamen, Iraqi police, Iraqi government. The war sort of being taken finally back into Sunni neighborhoods in a more aggressive way. For the first couple of years, Shias were very insecure. They thought Saddam was going to come back. They thought the Wahhabis are going to take over, sweeping up from Saudi Arabia as they had sort of historically. There's a real pathological fear of that. Beginning in 2005, there was sort of a realization on the part of Shias that maybe they have the upper hand. Sunnis for the first couple of years felt like they were the majority. They naturally deserved to rule, at least some Sunnis. It's hard to talk about groups in Iraq in such a monolithic way. By 2006, there was a huge shift. Sunni resistance leaders were no longer talking in a confident tone. They sounded now very vulnerable and weak and concerned. I was meeting Sunni resistance leaders in Baghdad, in Anbar, Syria, Jordan, and they were all saying the same thing. We lost. We miscalculated in 2003 when we listened to the fatwas of our clerics who told us to boycott the Iraqi government, and we handed over power to the Shias, to the Iranians. In a way, they made the same mistake in their mind that Shias made in 1920 when they boycotted the government and sort of allowed Sunnis to take over the state. This realization in 2006 was happening at the same time as the Americans had their own realization. That occupation is a bad thing. And General Abizaid, commander of CENTCOM, was saying that occupation promotes antibodies and resistance and violence. And there was a shift towards handing over security to the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army. As they stand up, we'll stand down, that whole thing. The problem with that was the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army weren't providing security. They weren't neutral. They were very much a participant in a civil war, killing people, raping, expelling. And there was a debate in the Senate, which Iraqis were very much aware of, about withdrawal, Democrats pushing for withdrawal. And Iraqis were watching that. And Iraqi Sunni friends of mine who were very pro-resistance to the occupation began to panic. And they told me, if the Americans leave, we're going to be slaughtered. Meanwhile, the Saudis and other countries in the region are watching with great concern. The Saudis are warning that if the Americans abandon Sunnis, they're going to pull in. Suddenly, we have a prospect of a regional conflict. If the Saudis come in, Iran's going to come in, Jordan, Egypt potentially. People are going to back sectarian groups in Iraq, various countries, in the wake of an American withdrawal. And Bush is finally paying attention to his legacy now. Sunni resistance groups are concerned about an American withdrawal because some of them, they're realizing that they're looking at the abyss of extermination. Many Sunni neighborhoods were totally devastated. Baghdad is more and more in the hands of Shia militias. In their mind, the Iranians have taken over Iraq. And they hear anti-Iranian rhetoric coming from D.C. And so you see the stirrings of the awakening movement. There had been attempts in the past on the part of Sunni militiamen to fight al-Qaeda. It was never an easy relationship. Al-Qaeda had access to funds, suicide bombers, which was a very effective weapon, but they had a very different agenda as minority of al-Qaeda fighters. So jihad until Judgment Day against Jews and Christians around the world. They didn't care about Iraq. The mainstream Sunni resistance groups, maybe pro-Ba'athist, maybe pro-Islamist, but very much Iraq-focused. They didn't care about the rest of the world or fighting any kind of greater jihad. And there was tensions in Fallujah when I was there in 2004. People were complaining about the foreigners who were banning smoking and dominoes and wanted to expand the fighting and sort of break the ceasefire that Fallujah Mujahideen had with the Americans. In 2005, in Al-Qaim in the Anbar province, you had resistance backing tribes fighting Al-Qaeda, but they were wiped out because the Americans were watching but didn't back them. The shift in 2006, with the first awakening group happening in Ramadi, was that Americans were actually subtle enough to stop saying things black and white and good versus evil and cut deals with local power brokers. People who some of them had been shooting at them. Abu Risha, the first awakening leader, so the third-rate tribal leader, a highway robber, we made him so much more important than he was initially. But we actually the U.S. protected him and collaborated with him so he wouldn't get slaughtered by Al-Qaeda. And that phenomenon was repeated very quickly throughout Iraq, basically leading to a Sunni ceasefire, to simplify it. And that was the first step. The declaration of the surge, in a way, was much more important than the surge itself. The knowledge on the part of Sunni militiamen that the Americans weren't going to pull out, but were in fact going to stay longer, meant that if they cut a deal with the Americans, they wouldn't get slaughtered by Al-Qaeda, but they would have the Americans backing them up so that they could one day take over the state. This was not a mercenary decision. Sunni militiamen weren't fighting for the money, weren't joining the Americans for the money. It was a very strategic calculation on their part. Work with the Americans now because they're going to leave so we can eventually face the Shias, overthrow this pro-Iranian government. It didn't work out so well for them in the long run, which I'll get to in a minute. Violence continued to peak, though, even into the surge, peaking in the summer of 2007. And I was in Diyala province a couple of months ago. Hundreds of villages in Diyala were totally destroyed in the summer of 2007, so 6, 7, 8 months into the surge. Totally blown up. Hundreds of villages. Each home is now just a big pile of rubble. So Bosnia-like stuff. Violence finally declined significantly following the Shia ceasefire. We had a Sunni ceasefire which began in late 2006 and sort of spread throughout the country, wherever there were at least Sunni militias. And just as Sunni calculations changed in response to the American declaration of the surge, so too Shia militia calculations changed, in that Shia militiamen now, by 2007, controlled Baghdad. They had won the war, cooperating closely with the Iraqi police and even the Iraqi army. In neighborhoods like Huria in 2006, the Mahdi army, working hand in hand with the Iraqi army, expelled thousands and thousands of Sunnis. It was a long convoy. It looked like people fleeing Bosnia. And you had, for example, there's an Iraqi army colonel called Colonel Sabah, I write about in the book. He was a Shia working in western Baghdad. He used to go arrest random Sunnis and demand that their wives have sex with him in return for releasing the men. So while Shia civilians suffered terribly in the part of Al-Qaeda, Shias had the upper hand. They had Shia militiamen, they had the Iraqi police, the Iraqi army, and they had the American military as well, which was pounding Sunni neighborhoods. So you had an August 2007 Shia ceasefire, which followed the Sunni ceasefire. Muqtada Sadr declared a ceasefire for two reasons. A, the Americans are going to focus on Baghdad. Better to lie low and wait them out. It's a surge. It's going to come and go, and I'll remain in charge. B, once his militiamen had finished Sunnis in their neighborhoods, they turned on their own population and became more and more like a mafia, and they were discrediting him. So he began to cleanse his own militia by assassinating rogue militiamen. As it turned out, both militias miscalculated. I thought it was a terrible idea to create these awakening militias when it was going on. I was wrong, as it turned out. These were militias that were sworn to overthrow the government. So the last thing you want to do in a civil war is create more militias. But these militias were only effective as insurgents when they were underground. Nobody knew their identity. They were sort of swimming with the masses. But Sunni neighborhoods were cleansed. And there was much less of a Sunni population to swim among. And now these Sunni militiamen, their identities were known, their addresses, their biometric data. The Americans had it. The Iraqi police and army had it. They could never go back underground again. So they were being targeted by al-Qaeda in revenge, but very quickly, by 2008, 2009, the Iraqi government began to assert its control and arrested them, killed them, issued warrants for them, so they fled. So this potential insurgent force, which I thought was going to actually strengthen as a result of the awakening phenomenon, was totally emasculated. And there are people who talk about, can the awakening guys return to the fighting? They don't even exist anymore. All the guys I know throughout Iraq are either dead, in jail, asking me for visas to the U.S., or they're in exile in Jordan. One of the top bosses that I write about in the book is now crashing at a friend's apartment in Sweden. So the awakening was finished. And the Iraqi security forces were sufficiently cleansed of their worst elements that there was no longer a need for self-defense militias, and that the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army could sort of adequately fill that security vacuum. They're brutal. They'll torture you, but not because you're a Sunni, but because you're a suspect, which is somehow an improvement. So your average civilian doesn't feel threatened when he sees the police the way he may have felt 2 or 3 years ago. So if you get arrested these days, if you're a suspect, they may sodomize you with a glass bottle. They may wrap a wet blanket around you and electrocute you, because that way there's no marks left on your body. They'll beat the hell out of you. But it's not gratuitous. It's to get a confession. To take the confession, go to court, find the guy guilty, he goes to jail. If he pays $10,000, $100,000, depending on who the judge is, he's going to get out, regardless of whether he's innocent or guilty. But at least you have a strong security force, which is not perceived to be as openly anti-Sunni as it was before. And in fact, they torture Mahdi army suspects just as often as they torture Sunni sort of al-Qaeda suspects. That's kind of an improvement. And then the Mahdi army declared a ceasefire, and I thought these guys are just going to wait the Americans surge out. But Prime Minister Maliki surprised everybody in that he declared Operation Charge of the Nights, even surprising the American commanders in Baghdad at the time, who had to quickly catch up. Going to war against the Mahdi army in the spring of 2008. At first, he was getting wiped out, his forces, and it was only thanks to American snipers and Navy SEALs and helicopter support that actually his forces succeeded in really crushing the Mahdi army in Basra and Baghdad and elsewhere. It was brutal, and many women and children and civilians were killed. But the Mahdi army was totally wiped out. And even though it couldn't happen without this American military support, Maliki got the credit. And even Sunni awakening guys that were friends of mine that hated Maliki because he was a Shia and pro-Iranian and all that, suddenly actually started to begrudgingly support him. He's a nationalist because that was the biggest change. Suddenly, you no longer had neighborhoods that were controlled by the Mahdi army. The Iraqi army was in Sadr City, patrolling alongside Friday prayers. Mahdi army officers had been bombed. It was a real night and day change in Basra in particular. People talk about before Charge of the Nights and after Charge of the Nights. So the Sadrists remain popular as a social movement, but they no longer have a real militia threat. There are assassinations. I mean, Iraq today remains incredibly violent, much more violent than Afghanistan for civilians. There's assassinations with silenced pistols every day and with sticky bombs, these are little magnetic bombs. You're parked in traffic, somebody walks by, puts it on your car and blows you up. But if you're a normal civilian, unless you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, when there's an occasional catastrophic explosion, you're much more secure. And people are staying out much later at night and going to bars and brothels, especially Iraqi security officers, police and army. If you want to meet them, that's a good place to go. I've heard. I mean, the Iraqi so the fact that the Iraqi brothels and liquor shops are open isn't something to celebrate in and of itself, but it's a symptom of the fact that religious Iraq-based militias no longer have the power to bomb them and close them. So nightclubs are open again. Women can dress in a sort of more, in a less conservative way. Again, a sign that they're not as afraid. There's conspicuous consumption, guys driving around in Land Rovers and Hummers, meaning that they're not afraid of being robbed. So Iraq today resembles, or will resemble, I think, more and more sort of life in Mexico or Pakistan or Brazil, in that there's terrible violence on the street, which people just have to sort of get used to, unfortunately. But it doesn't affect the state. The state in Iraq is increasingly powerful. It doesn't provide much in terms of services, and it won't for many years. Very corrupt, inefficient, brutal, as I said. Torture is routine and systematic, as is corruption. But there's no movement which is challenging the state, calling for its overthrow ideologically. The Sadrist, Sunni movements, as we've seen, all want to be part of the state. And they're all just looking for more services, more jobs. So the revolutionary phase of the Iraq war is over now. The Sadrists remain very popular, as we saw in the elections, but you can't. They've lost a lot of the wind from the sails. You can't be anti-establishment when you've been part of the establishment. You can't be anti-occupation when, for all intents and purposes, the occupation is over. You don't see the Americans. You haven't seen them since 2009. It's been Iraqi security forces conducting security. And you've been part of the government, but you're identified with corruption and inefficiency. So the Sadrists don't pose a threat, and I've actually been saying for a while that their participation in the government should be welcomed, because these are guys that you don't want outside the tent pissing in. You want them inside the tent. You don't want them marginalized and acting as spoilers, as they have in the past, but collaborating with you closely. And they do address, it's only grassroots movement which addresses real grievances. Incidentally, I just read that Muqtada Sadr arrived in Iraq today for the first time since 2007. Anyway, I should talk about the Americans very, very briefly. I argue that the decline in violence in Iraq, to the terrible level that it is today, as opposed to the hellish level it was 3 years ago, that's primarily a result of Iraqi dynamics and the Shia victory in the civil war, and an Iraqi populace turning against sectarian militias and even going to mosques much less than they used to. There's a real resentment of the religious parties, and the elections demonstrate that. But the Americans also had a role, and it wasn't just declaring the surge, which I think was the most important element in it. By 2007, you didn't have any mixed areas almost anymore, and you had a population that was totally just shattered. And the Americans took a few key steps which helped reduce the civil war, which they, of course, created. Building the immense concrete walls around neighborhoods was very effective. It was brutal, oppressive, ugly. It destroyed the social fabric further and harmed local markets, and it was impossible for kids to go to school. But it also protected neighborhoods. So now Shia militiamen, or Shia policemen, couldn't drive by Sunni neighborhoods and open fire on the houses because you had these 15-foot tall walls protecting them. There's only one entry point and one exit point, which meant that the Americans, or the guys working with them, the Iraqis, could control every vehicle going in and out, search it for weapons for young men who didn't belong, prevent weapons from being smuggled in. And they were living with the people in different neighborhoods in Baghdad. They could conduct a census to determine who belonged and who didn't belong in a neighborhood. Develop links with collaborators so they could root out insurgents or militiamen. And that was also very effective and helped. Killing was a very big part of the surge. They talk about population-centric counterinsurgency, but a huge element in it was just killing a lot of people. And 3 times as many civilians, according to the Iraq body count, 3 times as many civilians died during the surge at the hands of the Americans than before the surge. So it wasn't only population-centric. There was a lot of kill and capture operations, and airstrikes were much higher during the surge than before. But all these elements brutally helped reduce the civil war, and now Sunnis are sort of marginalized, and they're the losers in this in a way. But they're not being targeted for being Sunni, and economically they're still very active. Politically, maybe less so. The surge was meant to create a reduction in violence, so you could have the political space for negotiations, and everybody could sing Kumbaya. That never happened, but it doesn't have to happen. Maliki can be a dictator if he wants, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. The Iraqi state is strong enough. The Iraqi police and army are strong enough, brutal enough. You go to remote villages, and they have a presence there that they don't even need to compromise. I mean, I was surprised Maliki didn't steal the elections because there really wasn't much that anybody could have done about it. But by that point, none of the factors that helped reduce violence in Iraq exist in Afghanistan. The Americans aren't even really practicing counterinsurgency the way they did in Iraq. It's not only their fault. Iraq was much easier in the sense that it's urban. At least a lot of it is. It has infrastructure, roads. Many of the key battles happen in urban areas, grid-like structures. You can wall off an area, control the population. And counterinsurgency coin is much more about controlling the population than protecting them. Protecting them is just what we say so that people will pledge allegiance to the flag and feel good about themselves. It's about controlling the population and denying them the opportunity to cooperate with insurgents and showing them both positive and negative incentives. In Afghanistan, the Americans, for the most part, are not living with the people, and it's in part not only their fault. They can't, because you have many, many thousands of remote rural areas. The insurgency is a rural-based insurgency, just as the Mujahideen were in the Soviet days. So, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter who controls Kabul, Lashkar-Gah, Kandahar city, because the Taliban are going to be present in the rural areas, as they are. I mean, you leave the urban areas, you're in Taliban territory, and half an hour away from Kabul, they're patrolling like they don't have a care in the world, walking around with RPGs and AK-47s, as if there are no American helicopters in the sky, as I found out when I visited them in Wardak and in Ghazni. The Iraqi insurgency was primarily Sunni Arab-based. Sunni Arabs were 20% of the population, and as I said, they were brutally taught on the part of Shia militias and the police that they were the losers and forced to confront potential extermination. The Taliban is not a Pashtun movement at all, but it's dominated by Pashtuns, who are 40%, the largest group in Afghanistan. And the Taliban have every reason right now to feel like they have the momentum. You don't have any group that's potentially going to threaten Pashtuns with genocide, which is sort of the most successful counterinsurgency tactic. The British counterinsurgency in Malaya in the 1950s succeeded because they took 500,000 ethnic Chinese and basically put them in concentration camps. That's not going to work in Afghanistan, even if someone were evil enough to try it. And thankfully, the Americans aren't. So you can't brutally teach Pashtuns that they shouldn't support the Taliban or Afghans. I mean, Taliban is now spreading to Tajik, Turkmen, Uzbek areas as well in the north, which is just would have been impossible to imagine a couple of years ago. And Karzai is no Maliki. I know Maliki, and you know Maliki. I mean, Maliki's brutal and corrupt, and not a Democrat, although he thinks of himself as a Democrat. But at least he was able to impose his force on the country. At least the Iraqi security forces, maybe they weren't providing security, but they were brutally killing Sunnis in sufficient numbers that it destroyed the will of the Sunni Arab insurgency. Karzai is unable to impose his authority in the country. The Afghan security forces, while on paper we have over 200,000 trained, in reality you don't really see them. I was in Helmand in 2009 during the summer surge, and the American Marines and soldiers were pissed off because the Afghan army just chose not to show up. And they relied on ANCOP, on Afghan police who were very ineffective. Now in Kandahar, the Afghan army didn't show up, and they're relying on Colonel Abdul Razak of the border police, basically a warlord who in the past has sufficiently oppressed locals in Kandahar that people join the Taliban by the hundreds. So there's no real sign that the Afghan security forces are going to be able to take over security or brutalize somehow Taliban supporting areas enough that people will turn against the Taliban. In Iraq, the conflict was about oil fundamentally. Whoever controls the state controls the oil. It's something worth fighting for. Afghanistan, in theory, has lithium, but we're never going to get to it. Nobody is. The main resource in Afghanistan is us, is foreign money, particularly American money. Everybody wants a piece of it. Everybody has a reason to perpetuate the conflict because they're getting this massive infusion of aid and money and development contracts, which the country can't absorb, and is fueling this corruption. So it's our presence, which is actually this malign, corrosive presence. Even the Taliban get a piece of our money by demanding bribes from contractors working in their areas. In Iraq, the convoys protecting military routes were mostly foreign-owned private security companies. In Afghanistan, it's Afghan warlords. So we're fueling the corruption and the warlordism, which is one of the main problems in the country in the first place. And I argue, and on this perhaps I differ with Peter, that there isn't much of a reason to be fighting the Taliban in the first place, in that the Taliban is an Afghan-led movement populated by Afghans fighting for Afghanistan. No great lovers of human rights, but they don't have any larger ambitions apart from Afghanistan. They didn't invite Al-Qaeda into Afghanistan in the pre-9/11. They sort of inherited Al-Qaeda. And within the movement, there was a lot of grumbling about that before 9/11, and there were diverse opinions. And they've learned their lesson from that terrible mistake of hosting Al-Qaeda. And they've issued many statements hinting that they wouldn't do that again. And indeed, in Taliban-controlled areas, we haven't seen a return of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan, which I think is much more comfortable for them, better infrastructure, friendly tribes. They can, even Karachi, the drone strikes are pushing them deeper and deeper into Pakistan. In terms of ideology and orientation, I think Afghan Taliban have very different goals. Negotiation would have been the only solution. I think Holbrooke, who recently died, would have been the one guy who could actually pull off these negotiations, and now there's no diplomat with sufficient clout who can pull that off. But I find it baffling that we think somehow that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan would be a greater threat than Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, which has 100 nukes and 150 million people and a long conflict with India. And all we're doing is sort of further radicalizing much of the population in Pakistan, fighting a war in Afghanistan, which doesn't seem to matter. And certainly it's hard to show any signs of progress. Sure, if you invest 30,000 troops in Helmand province and hundreds of millions of dollars, you'll see perhaps a temporary reduction in violence, but that's not a sustainable model. You can't even sustain it in Helmand for very long, let alone replicate that countrywide, all the way up to Kunduz, and then elsewhere, because you're not going to have the troops or the money or support at home for that. So we can point to individual American tactical gains, a town here, district there, but they can't unite that into any kind of strategic victory. And as I said, I don't even think that there's a reason to, because the Taliban may be a threat to some Afghans, but I don't see them as a threat in any way to the U.S. Probably talked for long enough.
Oh, that was great. I mean, it was a very brilliant summation of the book and much of the history that has happened over the last decade. What you said, Muqtada al-Sadr has come back. This is one of the great sort of political resurrections of the last several years. What is his role going to be in Iraq going forward, and to what extent was he a kingmaker in these recent?
Kingmaker. Articles in the Times and Post lately have been calling everybody a kingmaker. You have so many kingmakers in Iraq. The Kurds were kingmakers. I think the king is Maliki, and he doesn't need anybody else, as I said. And he also learned from his previous term. The Sadrists pulled out in 2007, and Maliki's cut enough deals with enough parties, I think, that he won't depend on one party. He hates the Sadrists on a personal level. He's the guy that wiped them out. They hate him too. And they come from different classes, different ideological orientations and experiences. The Sadrists are very important. They're the only grassroots movement in Iraq. They represent legitimate grievances and aspirations of millions of Shias countrywide who remain neglected and poor. The Iraq conflict may have been seen as Sunni Shia, but there's very much a class conflict as well. And these guys, in the 50s and 60s, these are the people who would be supporting the communists in Iraq. The same revolutionary class, they're anti-establishment. The ideology almost matters less than just being angry and being anti-establishment. And Muqtada, the more angry he was, the more popular he was with many of these people. So it's not a resurrection in the sense that he always remained tremendously popular. He suffered in 2008, 2009 a little bit.
Because of being...
He was associated with many of the excesses of his own militia and corruption. But as we saw in the elections, first the provincial ones and now the parliamentary ones, his movement was very adept at politicking and still maintained its core, which is a few million people. There's no other grassroots movement in Iraq. There's no other movement which talks, at least gives lip service to issues of poverty and services and corruption and social justice. He's never going to be Hezbollah or Hamas. They don't have that level of sophistication, and they're tied with some of the worst sectarian violence, which means that it's going to be hard for them to cross over and gain Sunni support, although they can probably make deals in parliament. I don't think he's going to have a direct role in politics. He's going to be obviously in charge of his movement, but he was never very tightly in charge of it. I'm still convinced that he was never the guy calling all the shots, because when you meet him, and I met him a couple of times, he doesn't strike you as that kind of a guy. He spoke Arabic when I met him. It sounded like maybe an Iraqi version of Ebonics. It was like talking to... He just wasn't very sophisticated. It was like meeting Biggie Smalls in Iraq. It's probably not a good reference for most of the crowd. And he couldn't have been the one writing his speeches and coming up with his strategy. And there's been a lot of infighting and a really high rate of turnover for many of his both militia commanders and political bosses. But they've managed to really maintain a very committed core. As a militia movement, I think they're pretty much finished and not interested in that route. But as a political machine with some mafia links and corruption and a huge patronage network, I think that's what we'll see them going in that direction. Very much Iraqi nationalists. It's wrong to view them as somehow pro-Iranian. When they were weak, they turned to Iran for support. But fundamentally, these guys, from the beginning, were very anti-Iranian, very strong on Arab causes like Palestine.
How did, given the fact that they positioned themselves as Iraqi nationalists, how did the fact that Muqtada spent all these years in Iran play?
It's hurt him. Muqtada used to mock Hakim in the Supreme Council for spending years in exile in Iran while we were suffering in Iraq. So it definitely hurt him being in Iran. It hurt him because he wasn't in Iraq, and it hurt him because he was associated with Iran, which all Iraqis don't like, whether they're Sunni or Shia.
They call them the Persians.
Yeah, or worse. My father's Iranian, so the Sadrists used to even suspect me. And the Iraqi security forces doctrinally still view Iran as one of their main threats and enemies, along with everybody else in the world, probably. So his popularity has suffered. He isn't where he was in 2004, but he's also managed, or his people have managed to create a very sophisticated and savvy political machine. As we've seen, they won 40 seats in the election. They can't be ignored. Thankfully, they haven't been given any key ministries where they could do damage. But they've also been appealing to technocrats. They've proved adept at learning from their own mistakes because they want to win the hearts and minds of their own people. So the whole militia phase is really totally over. For a while, they were the biggest humanitarian provider in Iraq. In like in 06, 07, they were providing clothes and food to a variety of displaced people. So there's a real need for a movement like that. I don't view them as a negative phenomenon at all. Ambassador Jeffrey, the U.S. ambassador right now, was very negative on the Sadrists and warned, while the politicking was still going on after the elections, that if the Sadrists have too much power, then the U.S. is going to have to take all kinds of negative actions. But I think that their participation is a very positive thing.
Because it's inside the political process.
Yeah, they won't be marginalized and pushed to violence. They're going to be corrupted by the government and have to deal with mundane things like sewage and electricity. And a lot of their revolutionary fervor has been taken out too. As I said, it's hard to be revolutionary as a Shia movement when basically Shias now own Iraq. So you can be anti-Maliki because maybe he tortures some of your militiamen, or he doesn't give you enough in terms of your patronage network. But ideologically, you can't challenge the system anymore because basically you own the system as a sectarian Shia.
To shift gears slightly, you spent a lot of time in Kirkuk. What is the future of Kirkuk? And why is it important?
Well, people have been talking about the powder keg, the Arab-Kurdish fault line. Since 2003, the powder keg hasn't exploded, and the fault line hasn't resulted in an earthquake. So I think we tend to, journalists, not only, we tend to look for, almost like we're hoping for violence. I think it's not likely to happen in terms of any widespread way. Kirkuk is important because of oil, even though Basra has the majority of the oil. Kurds want it. They call it the heart of Kurdistan, the Jerusalem of Kurdistan, but only because it has oil. There's nothing attractive or romantic about Kirkuk. But they learned first from the 2009 provincial elections and then the parliamentary ones that much of Kirkuk is not Kurdish, is Arab and Turkmen, and votes supported Alawi. They've also, I think, the Kurdish star has faded from when it was sort of at its peak, in that after Maliki went after Sunni militias and Shia militias, he began to flex his muscles and encroach on territory that the Kurds thought of as theirs, and sort of the gray area, the disputed territories. And the Kurds have no chance for independence. De facto, they're independent. I mean, almost nobody speaks Arabic there. No real signs of the Iraqi state. But in a sense, it's actually almost like a Turkish vassal, in that Turkey so much is involved in everything that's happening in Kurdistan, especially economically. They've built everything: Turkish stores, the airport, the roads. The Kurds have no chance of suing for independence, and they know that. So they've adopted a route via Baghdad, and participating in the Baghdad government, de facto independence, I think. And they've improved their relationship with Turkey. Barzani and Maliki have kissed and made up after a lot of inflammatory language. So I don't expect any major violence. The one area where I could say the Americans have definitely had a positive role is on building these sort of trust and confidence-building measures and joint patrols. I think we'll see local conflicts happening. You know, a low-level Kurdish Peshmerga guy maybe getting into a shootout with a police captain or something. But I don't think it'll escalate to anything major because neither side wants that right now.
Great. Well, let's throw it open to questions. If you have a question, can you identify yourself? We've got a microphone, and keep it to a question rather than a lengthy statement, please. You'll go in back here.
Am I calling or you? Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm Helen Rafel. I'm with Resources for the Future, but I worked for 2 years in Uzbekistan, first in 98 and 99, first close to the Afghan border, not far from Kunduz, and then later in the Fergana Valley where terrorists were coming down from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and making problems in Uzbekistan. So I'm particularly interested now, given the situation that you've described, what are your recommendations to the U.S. government regarding Afghanistan?
It's easier to diagnose problems than to make recommendations. There certainly isn't any easy solution for Afghanistan. I think you have to begin with a recognition that it's a political conflict, which Obama and McChrystal as well recognized that it was primarily not a military conflict, although for some reason they persisted in pursuing a military solution, even after they identified it as not being primarily military. If you recognize that it's a political conflict, you realize that you need to, sooner or later, preferably sooner, negotiate with the Taliban. They're a major actor. They dominate much of the country. And they've signaled very much that they're interested in negotiations, certainly in many off-the-record conversations, and I think even in their statements. But we very much have rejected that. Petraeus, the American idea is maybe we should negotiate further down the line, but we want to keep them on their heels or weaken them so that they don't have the same momentum. But killing or capturing these mid-level commanders is only right now leading to a more radical generation, which isn't loyal to Mullah Omar and is creating more conflict with local communities, displacing elders. So negotiate, but these negotiations aren't very easy. Because while I think you have to negotiate with someone at almost Mullah Omar level of seniority, you also have to cut many local deals. And that requires a very complex subtlety, which I don't think your average military unit possesses. And maybe it requires some kind of a UN role. You need negotiations happening at a regional level. You have to deal with Pakistan, which means you have to deal with India. But you have to sufficiently placate Mullah Omar that enough of Taliban units throughout the country would feel satisfied, but you also have to deal with negotiations on a very local level. But tragically, even if negotiations are a good idea, they still ignore maybe what the greatest problem in Afghanistan has been, and one that we help perpetuate, the lack of justice. We empowered warlords, and there was no justice, which Afghans were demanding. Negotiating with the Taliban perhaps would empower them, maybe would lead to a decline in violence in many areas, but there would be no justice for their victims either. And I'm not sure if there's a way around that. But I think you need negotiations at the village level all the way to a regional level. And that would require the sophistication of nobody I can think of, but a civilian participation as opposed to a military one. I think a reduction in offensive military operations makes sense. I like the idea of the following idea. The Taliban de facto control much of the south and the east. Why not give it to them? They're going to have to rule. I mean, you can't be an underground guerrilla force. You're going to have some kind of infrastructure for services, for governor's mansion or something. And you tell them you can have Kandahar or Helmand, Zabul or whatever. If we see 6-foot Saudis walking around, we'll bomb you. And now it's much easier than sort of a remote drone strike through a window in some village in Pakistan. This is U.S. military talking about it. It'll be a B-52 in an entire valley. And they're going to be forced to somehow win their own hearts and minds as insurgents or as now a local government. Some perhaps cooperate with the Karzai government to some extent, which will, I think, inherently moderate them and having to deal with practical issues like electricity and services. And
they did a great job on that last time around.
Well, they're a very different movement as well. I mean, they argued last time around, I don't want to sound like too much of an apologist, they argued that because of the sanctions and the international community ignoring them and their attempt to consolidate their power, that they weren't able to do that. I mean, there were elements within the Taliban who certainly wanted to do that. But I think the Taliban is a different Taliban today than it was then, for better and for worse. And anyway, they're the force on the ground. And while we may not like the way they would rule much of the country, I don't think it's that different from the way many other Afghan factions would rule. And I think, more importantly, it doesn't pose a threat to the U.S., to U.S. national security. So you just have, strategy involves looking at your resources and assessing what are your important goals to achieve. And I don't see Afghanistan being very strategically important to the U.S.
Hi, excellent discussion. This is Doug Brooks from International Stability Operations Association. I'm actually interested in if you could elaborate a bit on the relationship between the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and sort of discuss that, because it's been sort of interesting and I don't think it's quite clear.
I don't think it's clear to anybody. So anybody who asserts too much knowledge about the subject, I think you have to be careful of them, and I'm not going to do that. But it's my view that they're fundamentally two very different movements with very different leadership and goals. And the Afghan Taliban has criticized the Pakistani Taliban for fighting the Pakistani government. I think we can definitely say that the Pakistani Taliban is closer to Al-Qaeda in its relationships and in its ideology and its statements. And indeed, we know that from the Times Square bomber. But the Afghan Taliban, I think, is fundamentally Afghan nationalist. They may make temporary alliances with other groups, especially when they have nothing to lose. They may inhabit right now some of the same areas, but I don't think they share the same goals at all, or the same background. I mean, obviously, the Pakistani state to some extent backs the Afghan Taliban, and to some extent is fighting the Pakistani Taliban. I think, though, the more time we let this fester, the more radicalized we'll see the Afghan Taliban getting, and the more they'll view themselves as part of an international struggle. There is a tendency. You want to arrest that tendency, in part by, I think, dealing with the old guard of the Afghan Taliban, which is much less of that international jihadist milieu than, however you say it, than the younger generation of some Afghan Taliban, just from my own personal experiences as well.
Andrew, we'll take some questions in the front here.
What became of all of those gigantic Air Force bases, military bases that were built in Iraq now that the presence of the Americans is so much reduced?
Well, the ones that the U.S. is no longer inhabiting have been turned over to the Iraqi state in one form or another, and many of them are just abandoned. the U.S. is going to maintain an enduring presence, as they say, in at least 5 bases. Interestingly, for economic reasons, they've had to cut back on their ambitions. They were hoping to keep a base in Diyala, but it's too expensive. At least that's the reason that I was told. So I think we're not going to see any large permanent bases in Iraq, especially because of the focus on Afghanistan. So that I'd say that the ones that have been turned over are either inhabited by Iraqi security forces or have been abandoned and looted. What we do see, you have 500,000 Iraqis who are homeless and squatting on public land. A lot of that is on abandoned Iraqi or American military facilities as well. Many of them, and the majority perhaps, were displaced from their homes. So they're living in military bases and abandoned factories, on dirt lots, on huge sewage lots. But military bases make very appealing temporary squatting locations for them as well.
Hugh McElrath, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I was interested to hear more about the effects in Lebanon of the, shall we call it, the Iraqi diaspora.
Lebanon wasn't affected so much by the Iraqi diaspora per se. You have Iraqi refugees there, primarily Christian, but also Sunni or Shia. But it wasn't so much the arrival of Iraqi refugees that was a problem in Lebanon as, well, there was this very small community of refugees, the Al-Qaeda refugees in a way, from Iraq that were a problem. Lebanon was already very fragile, practically a failed state before Iraq was even an issue. But historically, the conflict was either class-oriented, Sunni. It was a Christian-Muslim. There was no real history of Sunni-Shia conflict in Lebanon. And you had a variety of local and international reasons why that became more important. Prime Minister Hariri was assassinated. He, after his death, became rehabilitated as a Sunni national figure. A year later, Saddam is killed. He also, after his death, becomes a Sunni international symbol. I see Saddam posters in Yemen and in Palestinian refugee camps. The rise of Hezbollah, which is wasn't a sort of a Lebanon-focused militia. It's an army looking at Israel, but very powerful Shia force. And we've seen in Lebanon more than anywhere else in the Arab world a very successful campaign to increase sectarianism. And Sunnis in Lebanon, their ideology and their sympathies very rapidly switched in the course of a year or two. And in part we can blame Saudi Arabia for that. There's been a real sectarian campaign in the media in the Arab world since the war in Iraq, anti-Shia campaign. The Saudis have their own Wahhabi, so ideological reasons for hating Shias. They're also agitating against Shias because of Iran. Iran is a threat not just militarily, but symbolically because it supports Palestine, is against the U.S. And Hezbollah, likewise, is a successful model of resistance to American hegemony and to the Israeli occupation, which makes the Saudis and Egyptians look bad because they've accepted this collaborationist model of dealing with the U.S. and with Israel. So the Saudis, who dominate cultural and media production in the Arab world, there's been a very intense campaign of making Shias look bad. Shias are a threat. The Shias are trying to convert all of us. There's a variety of religious channels which are dedicated to showing that Shias are like worse than Jews and Christians, which is really bad. Safa channel is one example. Just 24 hours of Sunni clerics talking about how bad Shias are.
Must be great TV.
Shias and Iraq watch.
To follow up on that question, though, but so the Al Qaeda affiliates established themselves in the Pakistan.
Yeah, and so you had, as Al Qaeda was sort of losing the war in Iraq by late 2006, 2007, they began to look for other places where they could base themselves. Zarqawi had spoken, and in his last speech he talks about Jerusalem. Our eyes are always looking at Jerusalem. Israel-Palestine conflict is the conflict. And the group that dominates that conflict now is Hezbollah, which must be a real humiliation for Al-Qaeda because they don't have any sort of stake in that battle. Hezbollah is the one that defeated Israel in 2006. Hezbollah is the one that has this international popularity in the Arab world. And Al-Qaeda is totally not involved in that. And they've tried, and they really resent Hezbollah for monopolizing that conflict. So the units, individuals from Al-Qaeda in Iraq made their way back into Lebanon. Lebanon was a very key route for smuggling fighters into Iraq from the beginning of the occupation. Both Lebanese Sunnis and many Palestinians from the Palestinian refugee camps. There's one camp called Ain al-Hilwa, which is like an hour south of Beirut, where close to 50 or more guys have been martyred in Iraq from that camp alone. And you had networks of smugglers in the Bekaa Valley who were smuggling, in the past maybe were just smuggling goods, smuggled weapons and fighters into Syria and on into Iraq, often without the Syrians even knowing about it. So those routes for smuggling people and weapons into Iraq were reversed. And Lebanon's, if you're an Al-Qaeda in Iraq guy, your options are pretty limited. You're either going to die fighting in Iraq, or you need to go somewhere else. And all the neighboring countries are pretty authoritarian and don't like you. Jordan, Syria, Egypt. You can't go back home. Even the Afghan Arabs had that problem, but more so since 9/11. Lebanon is almost the only place because it has a very weak state. And while people say that Hezbollah is a state within the state, everybody else is also a state within the state. And that in Sunni neighborhoods, there's no real state either. And there are quasi-Sunni militias or neighborhood watch groups. So in the Palestinian camps, there's 12 Palestinian camps. And they form their own sort of archipelago where there's no law. And initially, as Al-Qaeda fighters from Iraq, so piggybacked on Palestinian fighters. With the demise of the Soviet Union and the Syrian withdrawal, a lot of these Palestinian groups no longer had access to resources, so they were eager to get funding from wherever they could anyway. And they were also too weak to do anything about the arrival of these Al-Qaeda guys with beards and money, even if they felt very uneasy about their presence. And a group called Fatah al-Islam suddenly emerged and claimed it was focused on the Western Front, on Palestine, but was hijacked by internal rivalries by a group that wanted to go to war against the Lebanese state. And provoked, at the same time, every group in Lebanon was trying to get it to somehow manipulate Fatah al-Islam for its own ends. So you get a lot of Sunni politicians in Lebanon who were hoping they could turn Fatah al-Islam and these Al-Qaeda guys into the anti-Hezbollah army, because Sunnis in Lebanon felt very weak and vulnerable, not having their own militia the way Hezbollah did. Historically, you could say the Palestinians of Lebanon were the militia of the Sunnis in the 1980s and before. So there was an attempt by Sunnis who are affiliated with the U.S. and the Saudis to instrumentalize these Al-Qaeda guys, and they failed. And so the whole thing sort of blew up in everybody's face. It was so people blame one state or another for the arrival of these guys. I think in reality it was a good example of these guys trying to manipulate local actors and states as well for their own ends. It was at the cost, though, of the total destruction of a Palestinian camp, Nir Rosen, totally flattened. Over 30,000 people used to live there. Most of them fled. Most of them weren't killed, but the camp was destroyed. And there was a huge increase in Sunni-Shia tensions in Lebanon after that. It still festers, this constant street clashes between Sunni and Shia youth. The thing is, nobody can challenge Hezbollah because militarily they're so dominant. There was an attempt in 2008, and in 24 hours in May 2008, Hezbollah and its allies took over the streets and basically taught everybody once and for all that militarily you can't challenge us. And so any kind of Sunni militia attempt to go after Hezbollah is doomed to failure, although there is an increasing appetite among some young men in parts of Lebanon and north and in the Bekaa for an Al-Qaeda-like ideology. Anti-Shia hatred is pretty intense in much of Lebanon, part of many young Sunnis. So there's constantly like a spark that can lead to street clashes, which can escalate into something else.
Great. We got lots of questions, so we should probably make the answers a little more.
Sorry.
Go ahead, in the back.
My name is Nir Rosen. I come from Pakistan. I have two short questions. Number one is that we have been hearing people discussing that Shia killed Sunnis and Sunnis killed Shias in Iraq. But we are not discussing the people killed by the airstrikes or attack carried out by the United States. So Do you think that we can afford putting the cart before the horse? Number one. And number two is about the drone attacks in Pakistan. CIA and American officials have been saying that there are 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda operatives in Pakistan. But since 2004, there have been 230 or 34 drone strikes. And over 2,000 people have been killed. And most of them are low-level commanders or unknown commanders. And they have failed to kill Osama bin Laden or al-Zawahiri. What do you think they can succeed in future?
I certainly don't want to make it sound like Iraqis just one day woke up and decided to kill each other. This is very much our fault as the U.S. It's not like Rwanda or Sudan where we can watch from afar and be like we had nothing to do with it. It's Hutus and Tutsis killing each other. The Iraqi civil war is a result of the American occupation. And leaving aside Iraqis killing Iraqis, the American occupation itself, as all occupations are, was very brutal, and many thousands of Iraqis were killed on the part of the American military in airstrikes and checkpoints and raids. And tens of thousands of Iraqi men languished for many years in American detention. Many were tortured and taken away from their families for years. Families traumatized, kids crying and screaming, "Daddy, Daddy," as their fathers being taken away. Women being left with nobody to provide for them. The occupation of Iraq was a brutal crime that was imposed on the entire country. I've just focused sort of on more the internal Iraqi conflict because it's been harder to look at, to report. So I certainly hope I didn't minimize that. As for drone strikes, I've only worked in Pakistan once and had a very negative experience in Quetta. So I'm not going to say too much about that.
I explain what that negative experience was.
The Pakistani state doesn't like foreign journalists poking around Quetta because that's where the Taliban are.
What did they say?
Well, I was as soon as I got there. I've been in Islamabad first. I got to Quetta in the summer of 2005. You're like the only foreigner there when you're there, so you're easy to spot. And there's really only one hotel to stay at, the Serena. So you're followed around the whole time. People say they're ISI. People that follow you around, not very sort of discreetly on scooters, rickshaws, and motorcycles. And a week into that, I invited the guys that were following me around for dinner. I thought I was funny. My photographer told me I was an idiot for doing it. I thought maybe I could get a good conversation out of it. The next morning I got a phone call. "Mr. Rosen, we know who you are. We know what you're doing. There's people after you. If you don't leave right now, the consequences will be like Daniel Pearl." So I left for Karachi on the next flight out a couple hours later. And in Karachi, it was the other way around. There were police following me around wherever I went, but I asked them why. They said it's because we're afraid of another Daniel Pearl and the bad publicity. And in Quetta, they have something to hide, or at least they did at the time, the presence of probably Mullah Omar and his family. Although, who knows, now they might be in Karachi.
In both places.
Yeah. I mean, Karachi is a much more comfortable place to live, and you're far from the drone strikes. Getting back to those drone strikes, I think one thing they have done is push people who were seeking shelter in the tribal areas deeper into Sindh and in Karachi, where you're totally anonymous. We hear from outside different reports about Pakistani opinions about the drone strikes. We hear that a lot of journalists who report about civilian casualties in the drone strikes are in the payroll of the Pakistani state and might be inflating some of the civilian casualties. We hear that locals in the areas of the drone strikes may support them, but then people in Lahore and outside of those regions are very much opposed to them.
May I just say on that, we did the first independent poll in the tribal regions that anybody's ever conducted, and they are very unpopular in the tribal regions. So the idea that somehow they're popular in the tribal regions because they're killing the Taliban is not the case. The Taliban is hated in the tribal regions, we also found, but they still don't like the drone strikes, which is kind of a more complex and more real snapshot of the situation than I think than some people have said. As a general proposition, they're also very unpopular in Pakistan. Gallup has done polling on this issue, 9% favorable views of the drones. And we have I think the most transparent database of these drone strikes on our website, and with we now calculate the civilian casualty rates dropped to about 6%. If you look at it over the life of the program, it was about 30%. If General Petraeus or somebody that was, people who know a lot about the program claim that the civilian casualty rates dropped to maybe 1%. The point is that the civilian casualty rate has dropped precipitously. Why is that? Smaller, better intelligence, smaller warheads. But anyway, if you want more information, there's a wealth of it on our website about each strike, who was killed, and one other point just on drones is the Obama administration has authorized this year, past year, 118 drone strikes, and this is really a policy of targeted killing. I think if it was a Republican president, human rights organizations would be making much more of a song and dance about it. Obama has authorized in 2010 3 times more drone strikes than George W. Bush did in his 8 years in office. I think it's just interesting that there isn't much discussion of it in this country. Obviously in Pakistan there is. But even in Pakistan, the pushback has gone down, partly because many of the people who are dying in these attacks are enemies of the Pakistani state.
Yeah, but by my statement, I want to make it seem like I support the drone strikes. Just that I have no idea. I think none of us really can, because it's so difficult to report the extent to which they're effective at killing somebody that the U.S. wants to kill or not. I think even polling in conflict situations is unreliable. But one thing we can agree on, I think, is that drone strikes have increased dramatically. Not just in Pakistan, but also Yemen and Somalia. And we have not seen a drop in violence. I think we've seen an increase in violence. And then there's an argument that decapitation operations, they say, keep the enemy off its feet. But on the other hand, I guess it's hard to prove that. But we do see that there's no real sign of a weakening of that alleged enemy. Well, I don't think that enemy is much of a threat in the first place. I think that, and I think on this, Peter and I agree, the threat from Al-Qaeda has been severely exaggerated, and for an empire like the U.S. to have this huge overreaction to the September 11 attacks has been sheer folly.
I don't think we agree quite on that.
No. I mean on the extent to which Al-Qaeda is a threat. I think
Al-Qaeda, the threat is diminished. But, the drones are very complicated. But, if you look at the Faisal Shahzad case, it's very interesting. Because Faisal Shahzad, who is, after all, trained by the Pakistani Taliban, so the notion that the Taliban don't plan to attack the United States is completely ludicrous.
Pakistani Taliban.
Right, but these are distinctions without difference. All the so-called Afghan Taliban groups are in Pakistan. That's where they live.
But they're trying to get back home.
But just to focus on this issue for 1 second, the Faisal Shahzad is very interesting because when he was sentenced, the sentencing, what he said at his sentencing is publicly available. He said that he was in Waziristan for 40 days, but he only got 5 days training. I think that I can't prove this, but I think that he only got 5 days training because Waziristan is a difficult place to get training right now because of the drone program, and so the drone. What's interesting is that Faisal Shahzad went to Pakistan to get training when the drone program was in full swing. So it's not deterring people from going there to get training. But what it is doing is probably collapsing the amount of training these people get. So if Faisal Shahzad had 40 days training, he probably would have managed to blow up the SUV in Times Square. Instead, he got 5 days. So I think the drone program is proving very interruptive. But I think Nir makes an incredibly good point, which is if the drone program was so successful, what would be the metrics for success you'd be looking at? One, you'd be looking at declining violence in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. After all, so much of the violence is coming out of the Fatah, and au contraire, the violence is actually at record levels in both countries. Two, you'd be looking at fewer Westerners coming for training in the tribal regions, and that's not the case because Westerners keep coming. It's very complicated, but it is. If you look, David Rode was here in Washington, and he did a presentation here on December 3rd. If you look at his account of what the drone program was doing to his captors, it was clearly something that they were very worried about. And he's obviously, involuntarily spent 7 months in Waziristan being held by these folks. And so the drone program is doing something, but it's not a panacea.
Hugh McElrath from PNNL again. The drone is an interesting mechanism, but what I think is more interesting, and I hear nothing about, and I'm hoping one or the other of you could speak to it, is what has happened to develop the intelligence network that enables such precise targeting. You have to know that somebody that you're interested in is getting in a car and going from point to point, and that person who reports has to be secure from the aftermath when they get hit.
Well, we've had dozens of spies being killed in the tribal regions, and some of these people probably really are spies. And I think that the number of CIA assets who are working, they are their ISI officers, or there's a lot of Pakistani cooperation, right? I mean, this is their country, and so that intelligence, I think, is pretty rich right now, and often accurate.
Iraqi spies who worked with coalition against Al-Qaeda told me of leaving sort of infrared emitting rocks by the house of the target, that kind of thing. But that's the... I mean that and I've heard that local collaborators in tribal areas are leaving similar markings at the house of the target.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, so let's try and maybe bunch some questions together. This gentleman over here. This over here.
Hi, Jeff Morley. I'm wondering if your take on the proposed U.S. drawdown in Iraq. Is it on track? It seems what you're saying, that the reduced U.S. footprint in Iraq is a positive development for the country and its political development. Does that continue, or is there a floor on where the U.S. presence should go? What's the future of the U.S. withdrawal plans?
Where should it go? I guess should depends on for who. I don't think the U.S. government was hoping for a full withdrawal. A great many Iraqi groups were. Maliki seems to be pushing for that, but the Iraqi military wants a U.S. military presence. The Iraqi military has a very close relationship with the U.S. military and needs U.S. military training for its it wants to get F-16s and various tanks. So we are establishing kind of, on the military level, some kind of post-colonial dependency, at least, because they're buying all these weapons from us and we've trained them, and they're going to depend on the U.S. for that, which is maybe good for some American corporations too. But in terms of whether the Americans were needed in Iraq, since 2009, you've had a test in that they basically withdrew from cities and handed over security to the Iraqi security forces. And while it wasn't pretty, like I said, they're brutal and not super competent and corrupt, they are able to maintain the Maliki government's grip on Iraq and prevent any militia activity from rising. And they're developing a lot of local sources. A lot of Iraqi police and army officers tell me that they're getting increased cooperation from Iraqi civilians, and Iraqi civilians will often say that these days when they call the Iraqi security forces, they actually come. So there have been sufficient improvements in the ISF that Iraq isn't going to fall, and there's no militias. Like I said, they've been decimated. Military-to-military relationships are going to remain, I think, very, very strong. But I don't think that Maliki politically can afford a large U.S. presence. I don't think the U.S. economically can afford a very large presence either. So I think it's going to be stripped down to special forces doing sort of Al-Qaeda, anti-Al-Qaeda type stuff, but wearing Iraqi uniforms, which is what they're doing now, and military training. As Iraqis are happy as long as they don't see the Americans there, and it's not the Americans conducting the raids, so they can feel sovereign. And I think that Iraq has been sort of sovereign since 2009, but not fully. You can't be sovereign when you have tens of thousands of foreign troops on your soil. But even once the Americans leave, Iraq isn't going to be sovereign in the sense that you have every country in the region pouring millions of dollars into its own factions. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, the U.S. is going to remain involved. But the military occupation phase is basically over.
Hi, I'm Matthew Walser from this project to resettle Iraqi allies. I'd just like to ask Nir about what you think of the refugee crisis of Iraqis that have fled, like probably the biggest in the region since 48 and 67 in Palestine. Many of these are middle-class Iraqis. Many can never go back from their work with the U.S. What do you see as affecting Iraq, inside Iraq, and the region in the coming years?
I think it's wrong to associate the Iraqi refugee crisis with the relatively small number of Iraqis who collaborated with the American occupation. Although obviously you have many thousands of those, and for a while they were a primary target. Although I think that those guys are much less of a target these days, the ones who remain. But you have close to a couple of million of Iraqis who are internally displaced. Most of them are never going back to their original homes. They spent the last 5 years, maybe 4 years, in new areas where they felt safer. And they're too scared to go back for the most part. So the way Iraq has changed demographically is kind of permanent, which is having many cultural changes as well. And then we have, it seems like about 500,000 Iraqi refugees. The number was really inflated on the part of the Syrian and Jordanian governments because more refugees equals more money. But it's still a huge humanitarian disaster. And they're sort of blending into the urban fabric of Damascus or Aleppo, Amman, Zarqa. There's a neighborhood in Istanbul, Yemen, Egypt. So the Christians, of course, of Iraq fled either to Lebanon or Syria to the west or to Kurdistan. And tragically, the very Iraqis that you would have wanted in Iraq to populate the government, professional class, were often the ones who fled, the ones who tended to be better educated, middle or upper class, non-sectarian, maybe a little bit secular. Not only, I mean, you have, but those were the ones who felt maybe most vulnerable because there wasn't a secular militia or a non-sectarian militia.
It's a great concept, a secular militia.
Well, they had them in Lebanon in the 60s and 70s. And anybody with money, I mean, even a little bit of money, if you were a doctor, and your kid would be kidnapped. So anybody like that was also very quick to flee, not even for sectarian reasons, just for their own safety. So they're languishing. They can't really work, many of them in their new countries. Even the ones who come to the U.S. get like 6 months of rent, and then they're on their own. And when you're 50 years old, you can't adjust to that new kind of life, let alone if you're living in Syria somewhere where you can't work, so your kids have to sell cigarettes on the street. That's a whole generation which isn't being educated. So long term, we may have a poor class of people. At some point, they're going to be integrated and just recognized as part of the Syrian population, I imagine. But you will have lost a generation, no education, and huge gap between the life they used to have, the life they have now. I think Iraq is actually safe enough for most of them to come back. But when you've lost a brother or a son or something, and you know your neighbor did it, or your neighbor knows who did it, then you're reluctant to go back. And there are incidents of intimidation. So you go back and somebody throws a concussion grenade next to your house. You don't want to take that risk when you already have lost so much. And those rumors spread like wildfire throughout the community. So they're not going to go back, basically. I've been consulting for Refugees International for the last 3 years on that subject, and it's quite clear that they're going to stay where they are, wherever they are, whether it's in Syria or in some new neighborhood in Baghdad. Many of them are squatting, as I said, in really very squalid and desperate conditions. So the humanitarian crisis remains, and unfortunately it's sort of being ignored by everybody.
I think we are running out of time. I want to thank Nir and congratulate him on his new book, Aftermath, Following the Bloodshed of America's Wars in the Muslim World. He's going to sign copies for those who are interested outside.